They were the latchkey kids who grew up in the silence of empty houses, only to become the most protective architects of the modern family. Generation X, the forgotten middle child sandwiched between the massive cultural force of the boomers and the endless spotlight on millennials. But here is the thing nobody talks about. The way they were raised, or rather the way they raised themselves, created one of the most fascinating psychological blueprints for parenting the world has ever seen. And once you understand what is really going on inside the mind of a Gen X parent, you will never look at them the same way again. So what happens when an entire generation grows up learning to fend for themselves before they even hit middle school? What kind of parent does that child become? And why do so? Many Gen X mothers and fathers carry a quiet tension between who they were and who they are trying to be. Those are the questions we are going to explore today. Because the psychology behind Gen X parenting is not just interesting. It is deeply personal for millions of people who are living it right now. But before we get into the heart of it, we need to talk about the contradiction, because Gen X is the generation that prided itself on independence, on not needing anyone, on figuring things out alone. And yet, study after study shows that Gen X parents are some of the most involved, most present, most hands-on parents in modern history. That does not happen by accident. There is a powerful emotional engine driving that shift. And it starts with something most of them will never talk about openly. Picture this. It is 1983. A 10-year-old walks home from school alone. They pull a key out from under their shirt, where it hangs on a string around their neck. They unlock the front door, walk into an empty house, and start their afternoon. No parent waiting with a snack. No one asking about their day. Just the hum of the refrigerator and maybe the sound of a television clicking on. This was not neglect by the standards of the time. This was normal. Millions of Gen X children across the country had this exact same routine. Their parents, the boomers, were busy. They were building careers, navigating divorces at record rates, and redefining what American adulthood looked like. And in the middle of all that change, their children learned a very specific lesson. You are on your own. Figure it out. That message did not just sit on the surface. It sank deep into the bones of an entire generation. It shaped how they solved problems, how they handled fear, how they built friendships, and most importantly, how they eventually decided to raise their own kids. Because that feeling of being alone in an empty house does not just go away when you grow up. It stays with you. It becomes part of the furniture of your inner world. And when you finally have children of your own, it whispers to you in ways you do not always recognize. Now here is where the psychology gets really interesting. You might think that a generation raised on independence would produce hands-off parents. You might expect them to say, I turned out fine, so my kids will too. But that is not what happened. Not even close. Instead, something almost opposite took root. Psychologists call it compensatory parenting. It is when a person looks at the gaps in their own childhood and makes a quiet, sometimes unconscious promise. I will not let my children feel what I felt. I will be there in the ways my parents were not. I will fill the silence with presence. And this is the quiet wave of emotion that runs beneath nearly every Gen X parenting decision. It is not helicopter parenting in the way people usually mean it. It is more like stealth fighter parenting. They are watching everything. They are tracking every detail, but they are doing it from a careful distance, trying not to smother their kids the way they felt smothered by emptiness. There is a deep awareness in many Gen X parents that too much hovering can be just as damaging as too little presence. So they walk this incredibly thin line every single day, trying to be close enough to protect but far enough away to let their children grow into their own people. Consider a composite example based on observed patterns. A Gen X mother sits at the kitchen table helping her daughter with homework. On the surface, it looks like any other Tuesday night, but inside her mind, a quiet calculation is running. She is thinking about whether she is helping too much or not enough. She is remembering what it felt like to sit at that same kind of table alone, with no one to ask at when the math did not make sense. She is measuring her own responses against a mental checklist she has been building for years. Am I being patient enough? Am I pushing too hard? Would my mother have even been home right now? She is making 1,000 tiny corrections based on her own experience, and most of the time, she does not even realize she is doing it. That is the latchkey legacy in action. It is invisible to the outside world, but it drives everything. And speaking of that constant inner analysis, it leads us to something even deeper about the Gen X mindset, because they did not just become involved parents, they became thinking parents, analyzing parents, parents who constantly question their own methods and motives with a level of self-awareness that borders on relentless. Psychologists have a word for this: metacognition. It means thinking about your own thinking. And Gen X might be the most metacognitive generation of parents we have ever seen. They grew up watching their parents make choices without much self-reflection. Boomers, for all their strengths, often operated on instinct and tradition. "Because I said so" was not just a phrase, it was an entire parenting philosophy. Gen X absorbed that, filed it away, and then did something remarkable when it was their turn. They rejected it, not with loud rebellion or public declarations, but with quiet, steady analysis. They started asking themselves questions that their parents never thought to ask. Am I being too strict? Am I being too soft? Am I projecting my own fears onto my child? Is this decision about what is best for them? Or is it about soothing my own anxiety? This constant self-examination is both a gift and a burden. On one hand, it produces incredibly thoughtful parenting. Gen X parents tend to be highly tuned into their children's emotional lives. They notice things that other people miss. They pick up on shifts in mood, changes in behavior, subtle signals that something might be off. They read between the lines because they spent their childhoods learning that no one was going to read between the lines for them. On the other hand, all that analysis can be deeply exhausting. It creates a kind of mental load that never fully powers down. Even when everything seems perfectly fine, the Gen X brain is scanning the horizon for problems, running quiet simulations, preparing contingency plans for challenges that may never arrive. It is the psychological equivalent of always having one eye on the door. And that makes perfect sense when you remember that for much of their childhood, they were the only ones watching. Now that we understand the emotional and cognitive engine behind their parenting, we need to talk about the thing that makes Gen X parents truly unique in all of human history. No exaggeration, because no other generation of parents has ever had to bridge the gap that Gen X bridges every single day. They are the only parents alive clearly remember a world before the internet, before smartphones, before social media existed, and yet they are fully responsible for raising children who have never known a single day without those things. Think about what that actually means. A Gen X parent grew up calling friends on a rotary phone that was bolted to the kitchen wall. They did research for school projects by flipping through an actual set of encyclopedias or walking to the public library. They got lost on road trips and had to figure out directions using a paper map or by asking a stranger at a gas station. Their childhood existed in a world of physical spaces, face-to-face conversations, handwritten notes passed in class, and long stretches of completely unstructured and unsupervised time. And now these same people are trying to keep their 13-year-olds safe on social platforms that did not exist 10 years ago. They are navigating conversations about screen time and cyberbullying and digital footprints and online predators using a framework of understanding that was built in a completely different world. This is not just a parenting challenge. It is a deep psychological one, because Gen X parents are essentially bilingual in a way no generation before them has been. They speak the language of the analog world and the language of the digital world, but they are truly native speakers of neither when it comes to the specific task of parenting across both. They understand in their gut the value of boredom, of unstructured play, of learning to entertain yourself with nothing but a cardboard box and your own imagination. But they also understand, because they are practical people above all else, that pulling their kids away from technology entirely is not realistic and might even put them at a disadvantage in a world where digital fluency is essential for almost everything. So they do what Gen X has always done best. They adapt, they learn, they figure it out on the fly. But there is a loneliness to this particular process that often goes completely unrecognized. Because there is no roadmap for raising digital natives when you yourself are a digital immigrant. No previous generation left behind a guidebook for this. The boomers certainly did not have answers. And so Gen X parents find themselves once again in deeply familiar territory, standing in an empty room, with no instructions on the counter, figuring it out entirely by themselves. And as if navigating the digital divide were not enough pressure, there is another enormous weight sitting on the shoulders of Gen X. Because this is the sandwich generation. They are caught in the middle in a way that no other generation has experienced at quite this scale or this intensity. On one side, they have their children, Gen Z teenagers navigating college applications and identity questions, Gen Alpha toddlers who need constant attention and energy, kids who need rides to practice and help with homework and emotional support through a world that feels more complicated and more uncertain with every passing year. On the other side, they have their aging boomer parents, mothers and fathers who are starting to need help with doctor's appointments, with managing medications, with understanding insurance paperwork, with the slow and sometimes heartbreaking process of growing old and losing independence. Some Gen X adults are dealing with a parent's dementia. Others are managing long-distance caregiving while trying to hold their own household together. And nearly all of them feel the quiet guilt of never being able to give enough time or attention to either side. Gen X is managing both of these worlds at the same time, every single day. And they are doing it while holding down demanding careers, maintaining marriages and relationships, paying mortgages, and trying desperately to keep some small piece of their own identity alive beneath all the responsibility. The psychological toll of this is enormous, but Gen X rarely talks about it. And that is not an accident. Remember, this is the generation that learned before they were old enough to drive that complaining does not change anything. You just deal with it. You put your head down and you keep moving forward. That resilience is admirable and real, but it comes at a cost, because stuffing down stress does not make it disappear. It just moves it somewhere else, into the body, into sleep problems, into the short temper that flares up over something small, into the quiet moments late at night when the house is finally still and the full weight of everything lands all at once. A narrative illustration of this daily reality might look something like this. A Gen X father spends his Saturday morning driving his daughter to soccer practice. On the way, he takes a phone call from his mother, who needs help understanding a medical bill. He makes a mental note to call the insurance company Monday morning before his first meeting. At practice, he sits on the sideline answering work emails on his phone, while trying to watch the game at the same time. After practice, he drives 30 minutes to his parents' house to fix a leaking faucet because the plumber they called never showed up. By the time he gets home, it is mid-afternoon and he has not eaten lunch. His daughter wants help with a group project. His son needs new cleats before Tuesday. His wife reminds him they still have not figured out holiday travel plans. And somewhere in the very back of his mind, in a place he rarely visits out loud, he is wondering when exactly he became the person that everyone depends on, because he grew up being the person that nobody checked on. That tension right there is the absolute core of the Gen X identity crisis as a parent. They built their entire sense of self on independence, on being the cool, laid-back, self-sufficient generation that did not need hand-holding or gold stars or participation trophies. And now they find themselves locked into a role that demands total involvement, constant availability, and a level of emotional openness that feels foreign to everything they learned as children. That is a hard shift for anyone, but it is especially hard for people who were quietly trained from a very young age to keep their feelings behind a locked door. But here is the thing, and this is where the story of Gen X parenting takes a turn that most people do not see coming, because despite all the tension, despite the exhaustion and the identity struggles and the impossible daily balancing act, Gen X parents are doing something truly extraordinary. They are raising children who are, by many measures, more emotionally intelligent, more resilient, more adaptable, and more self-aware than any generation that came before them. And that did not happen by accident or by luck. It happened because Gen X took all of that pain, all of that loneliness from their latchkey years, all of that obsessive self-analysis and quiet reflection, and they turned it into something real, something concrete, something that actually works. They did not just blindly repeat the patterns of their parents. They did not just react against those patterns in anger either. They did something much harder than both of those options. They examined those patterns honestly, kept the pieces that actually worked, threw away the pieces that caused damage, and built something entirely new from the ground up. That is not easy. That takes a kind of emotional labor that most people never even attempt. And I think that is the real gift of Gen X parenting. It is not perfection. No Gen X parent alive would ever claim to have it all figured out. But it is authenticity. It is depth. It is the willingness to look honestly at your own childhood wounds, acknowledge what hurt, sit with the discomfort of that honesty, and then make a deliberate, conscious choice to do things differently for the people you love most. That takes a kind of quiet courage that does not get nearly enough credit in a world that tends to celebrate the loudest voices in the room. Gen X parents are not flashy. They do not write long essays about their parenting philosophy for social media. They are not looking for applause or validation from strangers on the internet. They are just quietly showing up, day after day after day, doing the work, bridging the impossible gaps, holding the whole thing together with grit and humor and duct tape and whatever else they can find. And if you ask me, that steadiness, that refusal to quit even when nobody is watching and nobody is clapping, is exactly what makes them remarkable. So if you are a Gen X parent watching this right now, I want you to hear something you probably do not hear nearly enough. You are doing a better job than you think you are. The very fact that you worry about whether you are doing enough is living proof that you care deeply. And that care, that quiet, relentless, self-aware, sometimes exhausting care, is the single greatest thing you will ever give your children. It is better than any toy, any vacation, any college fund. Your presence, your attention, your willingness to keep showing up even when you are running on empty, that is the inheritance that matters. And if you are the child of a Gen X parent, I want you to take a moment to really think about what they have carried for you. Think about the empty houses they walked into as kids, and the full, warm, noisy, sometimes chaotic houses they built for you. Think about the bridge they are walking across every single day between two completely different worlds. And maybe, just maybe, the next time you see them staring at their phone with that slightly overwhelmed look on their face, give them a little grace. They are probably managing more than you will ever fully know. That is it for today. If any of this hit home for you, I would genuinely love to hear your story. Are you a Gen X parent? Are you the child of one? Drop your experience down in the comments below and let us know what this generation means to you. And if you found real value in this video, go ahead and hit that like button and subscribe so you do not miss what we have coming next. Thanks for being here, and I will see you in the next one.